Yesterzine, the literal magazine show. Every episode we take a magazine from the Golden Age, pass judgment over their best and worst rated titles, and see if the issue has anything to teach us about gaming in an age when the answer to "will it play Doom?" wasn't always yes. One machine that certainly did play Doom was the Sega Saturn, although that's a much more complex story for another day. In any case, the Saturn version of Doom came quite late, in March 1997. So as we open a copy of issue 3 of official Sega Saturn magazine, dated back in January 1996, the Saturn can in fact not play Doom. I'm glad that's clear. In this episode we have a classic Sega arcade machine brought to the Saturn by Sega themselves. We've the first Saturn title from a now famous and formerly 3DO only developer who presumably had just twigged what a bloody stupid idea that was. And we've got one of the very last times Sega let someone else convert one of their arcade games to the home. But is it also the reason for that? First though, I get to drag out my Saturn for some juicy hardware capture, because like almost literally every Saturn owner, I of course own a copy of
Sega Rally Championship.
It's not a surprise to see this up there. This is issue 3 of the official magazine. At the time of its writing, the system had been out in the UK for maybe a month. It's also certainly true that Sega's big strength at this time was arcade conversions. It was certainly its obvious advantage over Sony, which is why Sony had leapt fully into bed with Namco at the first opportunity. Given most people had come from the Mega Drive, seeing this track sequence in its full glory in Future Zone would certainly have been tempting. If we compare it to MAME's admittedly not 100% version of the arcade Sega Rally, then it's not arcade perfect. But it's pretty damn close, with only a slight reduction in resolution and infamous early home console pop-up giving it away. As an arcade game, Sega Rally represented a slightly new direction from Sega. While it's an AM3 game, the director was Kenji Sasaki, who had been lured over from Namco and who had previously worked on Ridge Racer. His directive had been to give Sega something the competitors didn't have, and thus the idea of Rally, something that hadn't really been done properly in the arcade before. The main Sega guy involved with Sega Rally is a guy whose work is likely to be more familiar to you, Tetsuya Mitsuguchi. He went on to found a company called Q's Entertainment, and then Enhance Inc., which means Rez, Lumines, Child of Eden, and Tetris Effect. He's also the only name involved in both the arcade and Saturn versions of the game. While Sega Rally features cars from Lancia and Toyota, it was not an especially close relationship, and certainly wasn't sponsorship of any kind. There was some information exchange and semi-official permission to use logos and iconography, but otherwise the development team was largely left to themselves, to the extent that the Lancia Delta engine noise in the game was produced by sampling from Mitsuguchi-san's personal vehicle. The big advance with Sega Rally was the different surfaces, and they're actually having some sort of effect on the handling of the car. The classic tarmac met boggy mud and some slippery dirt in a way that was supposed to be very noticeable. The big challenge with the Saturn version was mapping very much an analog arcade experience to a digital pad, something more vital to the overall experience than it had been with, say, Virtua Racing. The game does support the Saturn arcade wheel, and I'll try that out in a bit, but not many had that, so for a fair test we're using a standard issue Saturn digital pad here. We're also, unsurprisingly, using the UK release. But in this case that's important, because the American version had been rushed out for the holiday shopping season, and has bugs and graphical issues you will not find here. Sorry, Americhums. So one concern is laid to rest immediately. They've all but nailed the digital controls, even in a world where we've all been used to using analog-controlled racing games for the last 20 years or so. I had absolutely no trouble drifting around this first desert track, and it immediately feels rather great. It moves perfectly well too. The game box touts the incredible 30 frames per second visuals, which now is kind of adorable as a goal. But it's one the game hits in a way that the likes of Virtua Racing on the Mega Drive certainly did not, further increasing how impressive this must have looked at the time, although possibly more so if you'd never seen Ridge Racer. It's all the more impressive because during development, all Sega's 3D middleware, designed to help developers with 3D games, simply wasn't finished yet, presumably a legacy of some very late design decisions with the machine. So Sega Rally on Saturn was developed from scratch, without utilising much of the arcade machine code, and without the support of an easily accessible 3D engine by a team that almost exclusively wasn't involved with that arcade version. The results are impressive. Given the short development period, it's inevitable there's not a lot in the way of extended home version features. It retains the practice stage mode, I believe is in the arcade already, but also adds a proper time attack feature for setting lap times across the slightly stingy 3 stages plus bonus unlockable stage. To be fair, 3 stages is exactly what Virtua Racing and Daytona had, so it was consistent. The replay feature is also super impressive, able to show you a whole 3-stage run in its entirety. This is another aspect that was improved from the rushed US release for us Europeans. It's something we take for granted now, but having it then, especially one that recorded the entire credit, was a huge improvement. So while most people would have used a controller for Sega Rally, I spent some time trying to get a wheel working on the PC emulated version to try it out. Then I got annoyed with that not working and bought a proper Sega Saturn arcade racer wheel off eBay. For today's Wheel Gamer it's an adjustment. The wheel has about 180 degrees of travel, less than a fifth of my modern PC steering wheel, and thus it's really sensitive, meaning I struggled, as you can see here on my first couple of goes. But when you get it, you get it. The digital controls on Sega Rally are still masterful. To find out how masterful, go play the port of Sega Touring Cars on a pad sometime. But the game feels that it comes alive once you get a wheel, and in my case, feel comfortable going for the more realistic in-car view. Suddenly, I really get what this could have meant at the time. Arcade perfect conversions were simply not a thing in this era. But Saturn Sega Rally, with a wheel, comes perilously close to feeling like it, especially if you've not actually looked at the coin-op in a while. And these days, the arcade wheel is a surprisingly cheap eBay purchase. Even having to hold down a button on the wheel to accelerate due to the lack of pedals, it makes an already excellent game even more excellenter. Sega Saturn magazine went large on Sega Rally. The review is a densely packed and gushing 2 pages from our old friend Radeon Automatic, ending with a score of 97% and a plea to buy 12 copies. It's understandable, even in a world where Daytona and Virtua Fighter existed, this was the Saturn's initial crown jewel, possibly best illustrated by the fact Sega had to go back and take another punt at both those others to get the conversion right. In any case, it was wildly commercially successful, and that works for us. If you have a Saturn, this can be picked up for well under a tenner, and at that price, it's an absolute stone cold must-have for the machine. I mentioned an episode or 2 back that Thunderburner's problem as an arcade game was the lack of that just one more go feeling. Sega Rally absolutely has that, and with the variable length and difficulty options, and that always present possibility you never quite reach of a perfect run, it's going to be one of those little and often games for everyone. Way back in the day, especially on the computers, it was common practice for Sega to contract someone else to do their arcade conversions. We've already seen that this season with the utter hash that DSi made of Altered Beast, and the various fortunes of Outrun on the home computers is a now legendary tale. It even happened a little on the consoles, as the Master System's lower profile in Japan and the US caused US Gold to step in and publish some games the system would otherwise have not got. The most high-profile example of these for Sega fans was us in Europe playing a version of Outrun Europa not published by Sega. Which brings us to the congestion at the start of the Saturn's life. Sega themselves were busy with conversions of Virtua Fighter, Virtua Cop, Daytona and Sega Rally pretty much for launch, as well as original titles like Clockwork Knight, Panzer Dragoon and Worldwide Soccer. Plus then immediately starting on those remakes and sequels. There were 3 Virtua Fighter games on the UK Saturn within 7 months of the console's release. So it was inevitable something would slide off the side. And in this case, it was the already twice converted Virtua Racing from 1992, Sega's first true 3D racer. And this status ensured that a Saturn version, which could surely now be arcade perfect, would absolutely be a possibility. After all, this is the arcade machine. It doesn't look like anything the Saturn should struggle with. So the game was passed to the short-lived Time Warner Interactive, a company that existed as a bridge between being owned by two arcade giants. Yesterzine viewers will know it as Tengen, responsible for home conversions of games like Paperboy, Gauntlet, Klax, and of course, Pac-Man. In 1993 it was spun out of the rapidly decaying corpse of Atari, and by 1996 it had been sold to Williams Midway, most famous for Mortal Kombat. And in the intervening years, they were responsible for a minor-level war crime that you just knew would make an appearance at some point this season. They were also, to my knowledge, responsible for the very last release in the UK for the Sega Master System, just a few months before the Saturn's launch. So, a slightly confusing choice by Sega. But to be fair, this was a company that was formed originally out of Atari's home division. Either way, in this issue we see the final review of what is now Time Warner Interactive's VR Virtua Racing. No really, that's the name on the title screen. So perhaps it behooves us to see what the state of home conversions was at this point. The first attempt is this, on the Mega Drive, the one game to use Sega's competitor to the Super FX chip, the Sega Virtual Processor. This was a giant card that cost an astonishing £70 on launch, but to be fair, did things with the Sega Mega Drive that should have been entirely impossible. It wasn't the arcade. You can damn well see it's not the arcade. But it plays fairly close, and did contain all the content. The 32X got another attempt. VR Deluxe hid its status as Attempt 2 by adding a couple of cars and tracks to the mix. And yeah, it's better, if you had the machine and fancied shelling out another 50 quid or so. On first glance, Time Warner Interactive's VR Virtua Racing is so authentic to the original game that you might be tempted to just call it Virtua Racing for the rest of this segment. The music is right, the cars look right. We can shoot in the face immediately any suggestion it's arcade perfect, of course. You've got eyes. But it moves better than any home conversion so far. And in most important ways, it's at least an improvement on anything you could have actually bought before this. The music particularly is absolutely spot on. Arcade mode is here, present and correct as you might expect, and it plays a good game. But it doesn't quite play as the same game. The handling is different to the arcade and other digital ports of the game. Not bad, but certainly different. On this first circuit, corners that are flat in other versions aren't here, and that chicane will absolutely catch you out on the first few laps as it did me. It feels good though. Appropriate, and absolutely a functional transfer of an analog game to the world of digital, exactly as Sega Rally was. It does have one weird flaw though. The other cars in VR have very specific colours, stolen from Formula 1 teams of the late 80s and very early 90s. For some reason, only the back half of the field in this arcade mode has these. The front half of the field is entirely purple cars, almost like they started making the skins at the back and just forgot somewhere around the middle. It may be that they're trying to help you know which cars you're actually likely to be racing, but it's surprisingly off-putting as a thing, taking you out of the arcade experience. Which is a shame when the rest of it is so solid, if not entirely authentic to the original coin-op. There's nothing added here in terms of gameplay, presumably a license restriction, so you only have the one car and 3 classic tracks set in Europe, North America, and famous non-European location, Greece. It also shares Sega Rally's full replay mode. It's a weirdly silent thing, but it keeps the 4 selectable cameras from the actual game and adds a couple more for good measure. Most people porting a 3-year-old arcade game in a project clearly intended by Sega to flesh out the system's library alongside their newer, more glamorous coin-ops would have stopped there. And you couldn't really have blamed them if they had. It's got as much content as the £70 Mega Drive version, double the frame rate, and, weird purpleness notwithstanding, looks a hell of a lot better for around £30 less. Time Warner Interactive's VR Virtua Racing by Time Warner Interactive does not stop there. It doesn't stop there at all. Sega Rally's grudging doling out of a time trial mode pales into oblivion at the very sight of this game's Grand Prix mode. For a start, there's another 7, count 'em, tracks, ranging from a near oval to a bunch more complex even than the arcade game's expert track. These are of variable quality, of course, but all are valid, and there's a decent amount of variety in the scenery. All will take time to learn and master, and you'll have that time too, for 2 major reasons. Firstly, there's a bunch of new cars, starting right down with a go-kart and ranging to a prototype that in a straight line is even faster than the default F1 car. You will of course start in that go-kart with its top speed of 90 miles an hour. Slow it may be, but it's fun, and it takes a different skill to the main game to successfully race a bunch of other go-karts who are of course equally slow. Weirdly, in feel, if not in any actuality, it almost reminds me of actual go-karting in packs, as avoiding the very slow and no doubt part of a stag party karts becomes key while racing the good guys, as momentum loss takes ages to recover. The other reason you'll have time is the races are a full 10 laps, which in the go-kart is going to mean at least 10 minutes. Chumley Warner's Virtual Teabag very much leaves the arcade mode for the arcade crowd. The career mode is going to take a bit of dedication to get through. You helped a little though. You don't have to do all 10 races if you're good. To progress from go-karts you just need 20 points. Timo Werner's Volley Rally uses the F1 points system of the time, so 10 points for a win means you can, as I did, get yourself into a lovely stock car inside 2 races. In my case at the easiest and hardest tracks in the game. Progression further adds 10 points each time, up to 50 points to unlock that F1 car in career mode. But it's still way short of requiring you to win in absolutely every race, as it should be in a mode like this. In fact, there are surprisingly few failure conditions in career mode. Yes, you can screw up a race and get no points, but you can't retire from a race through damage, and there's no time countdown in this mode either. If you want to tool about in 15th like you're driving to Tesco for something very slow, like a set of sloth pyjamas, then go right ahead. Which does beg the question of why these new tracks have mid-lap checkpoints just like the arcade ones, when the only effect they have is to play one of the 10 to 15 second long music jingles. That's probably my answer actually, isn't it? As the soundscape in Tim Henman's very Fistpump is as stark and spacious as it ever was, with the music being the only respite from the quiet engine noise and skids that often sound a lot like my cat complaining. There is a little more. There's a practice mode which again does more to justify its existence than Sega Rally's. Here, right from the off, you can use any of the cars at any of the 10 tracks for runs of between 1 and infinite laps. It's a refreshing lack of gatekeeping between you and just having fun, especially if the battery in your Sega Saturn needs replacing and thus saving doesn't work. For instance. You can even have a race of sorts on this mode, as 4 drone cars can be turned on. As a package, this is an impressive one. Taking this easygoing but deep approach to career mode is a very good choice. It's exactly what the game needs to justify being a full-price title on a new machine, especially up against more in-your-face newer arcade conversions. There's a lot to like and a lot to play here. The 3 distinct modes fulfilling every arcadey driving game need you could want, and there's even a 2-player split-screen mode. Tim Wilson's interactive visual rectal prober does also support the wheel. It's not quite as effective as Sega Rally with it though. Whether that's just because VR was always kind of more a digital game in the first place due to the lack of drifting, or just less effort on Time Warner's part, I don't know. You feel like you really have to use the full travel of the wheel to do virtually any corner, so to a degree it just becomes an awkward joypad. Not an unpleasant experience by any means, but not the one you'd rush out and buy the wheel for. Sega Saturn magazine were fair to the game, and it was very unfortunate really that it came out the same month as the astonishing technical achievement of Sega Rally. It got 77%, with Richard Ledbetter correctly praising the detail while spotting that it probably could have been a better pure arcade port. And ultimately that's what most people were probably actually looking for. In 1995, he's right. In 2020 though, Time Warner Interactive's VR Virtua VR Racing by Time Warner Interactive comes into its own. It's not the best way to play pure Virtua Racing. M2's utterly peerless recent conversion to the Nintendo Switch is that, with its 60 frames per second update, utterly eradicated pop-up and 7-player split screen. But unlike every other version of VR, it's not been invalidated by the existence of that version. With the career mode, unique changes and tracks and cars that never made it to any other version, this is a game all to itself, and cheaper than the 32X version to bag yourself a copy of. If you've any kind of love for Sega-style arcade racers, this is one you should own. It's less an arcade port than a home-only sequel, and a genuinely hidden in plain sight gem in the Saturn's library. It's probably the Saturn game I'm most pleased I own. Which leads us, from one of the Saturn's best-known classics, past a eulogy for an underappreciated favourite, to a game I actually didn't even know existed until I read through this magazine, hoping the gaming hell would be interesting enough to base an episode involving the other two on. I'm not sure what I found. So let's start with what we do know. The game in question is Off-World Interceptor Extreme, and the review is of little use to us, spending a third of its runtime musing on the fact that in the 90s everything has to be extreme. We've covered that before, of course. At this point Sega was still kidding themselves that the big title for Christmas was going to be Sonic X-Dream, which we talked about right back in episode 6, and which I'm running some of the only known footage of under this in an effort to not show you any of this game until I figure out what the bloody hell is going on. The story does not help us. After that fiasco last episode, Rose Tinted Spectrum is not returning my calls, so let me just thumb through the YouTube Rolodex. What? We're retro YouTubers, we're not exactly going to use an address book here. Aha! This is a job for snorkers, isn't it?
You're a trash man! You dig smearing a planet's surface with outlaw scum! You're a bounty hunter with bloodlust on the brain and dollar signs in your eyes. Your mission is to rid the universe of fugitives, felons, swindlers, two-timers, terrorists, and other trash that infest the off-world colonies. Suffer through the brain-boiling climates of alien planets as you pound at searing speeds over treacherous terrain. Crash nose to tailgate with metal-crushing 4x4s and dodge deadly road obstacles. Skim through enemy attacks. Live for stomach-dropping ramps. Reach each target waypoint before your prey. Extreme carnage is your SOP. You crave speed, explosions, firestorms, and crunching chassis. You are a predator. Definitely not for wussies.
Well, that's as clear as a planet smeared with outlaw scum, isn't it? A bounty hunter game where it appears the success metric is reaching a waypoint before them. But that's not how bounty hunting really works, is it? So is this a racing game? Is this a shoot 'em up? Yes. But also no. We turn to the intro for assistance, and the initial news is promising. Crystal Dynamics were a very new outfit at this point, but they'd already turned out some reasonable stuff on the 3DO, including the perfectly acceptable racing game Crash and Burn, which had been bundled with the machine. It turns out that this too is a 3DO port, part of a series of titles that came across to the more popular consoles as the 3DO, well, crashed and burned, basically. Crystal 2 would go on to Pandemonium and Legacy of Kain, among other things, before, in 2006, being handed the keys to the Tomb Raider franchise, which they kept right up until stepping back from Shadow of the Tomb Raider to develop this year's Marvel Avengers game. As I say this, you may be noticing this intro is not shedding any huge light on the game, and I haven't seen anyone that old playing a schoolchild since literally the last time I watched anything on American TV. And the reason for that is, it's not an intro. It's just a video showreel for all the other games they've panic ported from 3DO. I'm not entirely sure they've understood the concept of an attract loop. The real intro when you start a game is worse. So much worse. Not so for the intro itself, which is kinda a fairly generic FMV era mission briefing with FMV era acting. It's actually got charm in a lo-fi kind of way, and you can see how much video quality improved dramatically from the Mega CD era. No, what makes it worse is the game makers themselves, presumably going for some kind of post-ironic 90s approach, have decided to turn it into a Mystery Science Theatre or Riff Tracks kind of deal, and hired the two least funny humans in the entire world to talk bollocks over it, neatly ensuring that not only do you not hear the intro, but also come to wish they would be your first target, just so they'll shut the hell up for 5 dang seconds.
In its infinite bleeding heart wisdom, the Geo Tribunal passes the bounty bill, and civilians get to fulfill their death wish.
Here's to Death Wish in all of Bronson's
You will
films.
be shown the whereabouts and profile of the wanted
Hello.
Those of you who choose to go
I don't know about you, but I never felt the average FMV intro would be improved by two people putting on awful sub-Gilbert Gottfried accents and making several sexual assault jokes in a 3-minute intro.
We wouldn't have it any other way.
The game itself isn't FMV, although given your freedom of movement, it might as well be. You've got even less agency than you did in, say, Moon Patrol, and really for the first levels of each world, you really just have to get to the finish. There appears to be a time limit, but I ignored it, and it was never even remotely an issue. Just use your infinite blaster to kill a bunch of crap, hold the accelerator down and don't get shot too much. There are weapon and nitro pickups as well as the slightly more important armor ones, but it's also very dull really. At least if it had been FMV, it might have been pretty. In reality, what you're mostly driving down is in effect a low resolution corridor. There's 4 levels of this. I stormed through them all to get to the boss, where, given the 8 million weapons on 8 million keys, I mostly got myself crossed up, and died twice because I accidentally changed view. The joke is you need to do none of this. For this first boss, you immediately pick up a bonus that makes your pea shooter main weapon fire sideways. Guess who can't fire sideways? The boss. It's tedious, but you can 100% defeat him just by driving along the side like this and adjusting so your weapon just about picks him up. He won't get a shot in. And then you get a lot of money, and oh crap, another cutscene with Statler and Waldorf's tribute act, who managed to make at least 2 more jokes that will make sure any woman still playing this trash stops doing so in a bare minute of between level cutscene. I suggest, if you're not a woman, you still do that.
You take a lot of chances, trash man.
It's sanitary engineer.
Don't take too many.
Are you starting to care? Hey, she digs us. Yeah, we're gonna get some. Yeah.
I did start the next planet. It's more of the same with a different colour palette. No one needs to see more of this. They should have left it back on the 3DO where at least fewer people would have to see it. The game itself is dull, repetitive and simplistic. The one boss I could stand to play, insultingly stupid. And the less said about somehow thinking adding drunk frat boys to FMV would improve the situation, the better. The Saturn was not the best supported system, but it has a large library of great games. I have yet to play a single Saturn game worse than this, and I hope I never do. If you're a watcher of this show, or follow me on Twitter, or stand still for more than 35 seconds in my presence, you'll know James O'Grady, aka What Ho Snorkus. Failing that, you probably heard me name-check him before he embiggened this episode a mere few minutes ago. If you still don't, then I'm not sure how to help you. Snorkus, for the uninitiated, is also on YouTube, where his primary stream of awesome video media is taking Spectrum typing games from those classic books of the 80s, typing them in, fixing the bugs, and showing you all what they're like. But then he improves them, adding graphics, game modes, and gameplay ideas the original creators either didn't think of or couldn't do. But until now, you've not been able to play these versions yourself. All this changes, thanks to Spectrum Retro stalwart Jim Blimey, who is now hosting the enhanced versions from Snorker's videos for you, the discerning retro gamer, to wrap your Spectrum hole around. You'll find the archive at jimblimey.com/games. You'll find Jim Blimey on Twitter at JimBlimey, and Snorkers on Twitter as @JamOgrad. While you're at Jim's site, why not check out his own games, including the recent release Sublets. And that's the show. If you want more of this, then simply rewatch this video, or perhaps one from the previous 3 seasons. Alternatively, mash the sub button like an idiot an odd number of times and sit back and wait, confident in the lies you understand how a toggle works. If you've done that correctly, we'll see you next week for a movie license, a racing game showdown, and in a way that really makes it look like I planned this stuff, another game with a tie to the Avengers. What ho!
Death Chase!